Good evening and a very warm welcome to this analysis of 2015-2016 budget analysis on Citizen TV with Deloitte East Africa. Now tonight we'd like to delve into conversations that will unpack the numbers given to us by the Cabinet Secretary for Finance last week and to ask critical questions about what this says about government priorities and most importantly what this means for us as stakeholders in the Kenyan economy. My name is Terry-Ann Chebet and I'll be steering this conversation tonight, and I'd like to first invite my distinguished panel who will be joining us to talk about some of these very critical issues. Fred Omondi. Fred Omondi is a tax partner at Deloitte East Africa, and his specialty is transfer pricing, corporate as well as international tax. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Mr. Omondi. Next on, we've got Ali Kansachu. All right, thank you so much. Ali Kansachu is the CEO of Rich Management and, of course, a very well-known name in East Africa's business circles. Ali Khan, thank you so much. It's great to see you this evening. And next we have Nikhil Hira. And, of course, as many of you know, Deloitte East Africa is home for Nikhil here as a tax leader there, as key specialties, indirect customs as well as excise tax. Nikhil, so good to see you this evening, Karibu Sana. And we also have Polycarp Igave. Polycarp is the managing director of Viva Energy, a key player in the downstream oil business, and of course a very ardent representative of Kenya's private sector. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Also in the audience, Martin Odoro-Tieno, Deloitte East Africa, financial services leader, as well as a partner. Of course, a man who needs very little introduction. Has got a wealth of experience in the banking sector, following service at Kenya's biggest bank by assets, and that's, of course, KCB. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, our audience, for joining us. We'd like to go straight into the conversations tonight. And first, I'd like to get your impressions, your initial impressions after you listened to the budget statement last week. And let's start with you, Polycarp.
Thank you very much, Ariane. A very good budget. Private sector celebrates the budget. Excited about the investment in transport and logistics, the focus on security, and also creating social safety nets for the lowest cadres in the society. So, especially for manufacturers, this was a manufacturer's budget. When we look at the minister really concentrated in making sure that local value addition is celebrated, 40% procurement. So. More positives than negatives. All
right, absolutely. And of course, we'll be delving into the manufacturer's budget in just a moment. Nikhil, anything surprising for you?
I think it was a little confused, actually, because I felt that we'd seen some of these things before. There was an element of forward thinking, but there were no concrete measures that I felt which would really boost us going forward into the next 10 years. It was almost a great written plan, but whether we can actually implement it seemed a little bit doubtful to me.
All right, of course, I believe that's about walking the talk, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about that in just a moment. Ali Khan,
yes.
Was it a bland budget for you, or is it something that you liked?
I think a couple of things I'd point out, Terry, and I think, there's an optics, there's like a Hollywood element to it. We always want to put these very big figures out there. The 2 trillion number caught everyone's attention. But in point of fact, we actually undershoot both ways. We don't raise as much revenue as we sometimes say we will, but we spend less typically. So I think, but in the whole, Terry Ann, I thought, the stock market has been very happy about the repeal of the capital gains tax. And I think on balance, it hit the right spots. Going back to Polycarp's point about security, we need that in order for the economy to grow at those elevated numbers we want it to grow at.
All right. And of course, in our audience, we've got people who are really keen on finding out more about the capital gains tax and how that will trickle down to investors. Fred, was there anything interesting for you in this budget?
I think for me, the minister demonstrated that he listened to business in terms of addressing certain concerns. For example, in terms of capital gains tax, we all know the impact that it had on the stock market, and the minister sort of listened to their representations, and also in terms of loss carry forward and trying to protect the local manufacturers. So in a sense, he did listen to what some of the constituencies were looking for. But at the same time, given that it's an expansionary budget, then we must expect to be able to pay for some of these programs. So in a sense, there's a pain that comes with it.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about manufacturing to start with. At least two of you have mentioned it on the panel this evening. You said this is a manufacturer's budget. You've been in the space for a long time where you have been the voice for the private sector where the majority of manufacturers are. In a sense, what does it say about the government's priorities in as far as manufacturing is concerned?
I think the minister sort of stated that he wishes that the Kenyan consumer starts to buy goods that are manufactured in our country. I'll give you an example. Just coming home to my own energy sector, gas cylinders. We saw an introduction of duties to encourage the gas cylinder manufacturing in Kenya. And majority of Kenyans, 8 out of 10 households, they use charcoal or kerosene. So that move of trying to encourage cheaper, locally constructed cylinders, as we expand penetration of gas in Kenya, that it's gas that's manufactured here. That's a good thing. Paper. We use a lot of paper on bread. I think we've seen that some advantages come through paper. And many more. I mean, wheat. We've seen a lot of cost to live. And also on transport and logistics, the focus on roads, the focus on ports, on ferries, so that it's easier for us to move goods. We live in a region where we are almost 500 kilometers from the sea, unlike many other African countries that actually live at the sea. So it's expensive to actually do everything. So once you start to unblock the logistics bottleneck, it helps. Mm-hmm. I also celebrated the fact that it's sinners who are going to pay for all those things, people who take beer and cigarettes.
All right, let's look at the flip side. And Nikhil, I'd like to rope you in as much as, yes, there's been quite some positive sentiments about a push for the local manufacturing sector, but there's also a fear about protectionism. And beyond that, protectionism of sectors such as sugar, which many would say is actually inefficient in its current state. So are we pushing for protectionism for inefficient industries?
Just before I answer that, you're right, the sinners are really going to suffer in a big way, I'm afraid, particularly since he said he's going to raise an additional 25 billion from those sort of things. Protectionism, to me, there's nothing wrong with being protectionist. If you want to help your people, your citizens, create employment, etc., yes, we can be protectionist. The problem that comes is that we become protectionist and our manufacturers become inefficient. So if we're going to really use those measures that he announced, then the manufacturers have got to play their part to become more efficient in their processes and make Buy Kenya a reality. And at the same time, the government has got to provide the infrastructure that is required to make sure that they can be efficient. Because a lot of their inefficiencies are probably coming today because they don't have the infrastructure in place.
All right, I still want to touch on manufacturing for just a moment, and this is open to anyone on the floor, really. I mean, there was quite some interesting things. Salmonella, how many people manufacture spaghetti in this country? Was it so important, that was introduced into the budget? What did you think about that?
Yes, of course. I mean, if you look at Kenya, if you look at our sources of starch, we've moved away from ugali and gone into rice, into pasta.
But that is the urban
I'll tell you what.
Kenyan.
I'll tell you what. Mandazi, they are called ngumus. across the country. Let me just, that's the local name. It's very important that that value addition, because all we were doing is basically milling wheat. Now, as you get into value addition, into biscuits, into pasta, into those goods, it was very important that the minister actually attended to that. And I think there's a perception that the Kenyan manufacturers are inefficient. I'll tell you now, one of the best things done to Kenyan manufacturing was liberalization of the economy. We didn't ask to be protected from the global economy. And therefore, the Kenyan manufacturer has withstood a lot and has become very efficient. Right now, we expect to see, for instance, in the textile sector, 100,000 jobs after the AGOA Act has been extended with another 10 years. And we've further seen in this budget, the minister allowing us to get some tax incentives from hiring young people. If you hire young people, you get tax incentives. I think we beat the government enough. Sometimes when they do a good job, let's give them a round of applause. They did a good job with this budget in terms of manufacturing. Actually, we may be the ones who let ourselves down by not really following through and doing the right things. But perhaps the only downside manufacturers would say is we want to see the tax authority, Kenya Revenue Authority, start to fish in another pond. They go fishing just in the usual pond. So the usual suspects of raising tax are the same. So and I'm happy with the rebased GDP because now they're only collecting 18% of the GDP. They used to brag they were collecting 23. Now let's see whether they can collect.
In fact, now that you've talked about collection, a target of 1.3 for KRA, is it achievable with the current economy as it is, Fred?
Well, to start with, the minister, I think, projected that number based on an estimated 7% GDP growth, which, as you know, is quite ambitious. And I think recently the World Bank actually had to revise its projections in terms of where the emerging markets are supposed to be. So I think it's quite ambitious, but it goes down to the point that Polycarp is making, that they have to widen the net and try to get this tax from, maybe the informal sector or others that are not quite contributing their fair share. So if they keep going after the same people, then probably will be, some way off the target. So it's quite a tall order. I think, it's really up to the KRA and indeed their team to be able to up their game and try to get new sources of revenue.
All right. You've mentioned ambitious, and Ali Khan mentioned Hollywood,
yes,
which is a utopian world, so to speak, given what we're discussing here this evening. And I'm just wondering what your perception is about where the economy is set to go in 2015. We've talked about the 7% that can be too ambitious. It's probably too ambitious. But how do you see the economy playing out?
So I think the majority of people are looking for quite a strong year in the economy of around 6%. I think that's where the World Bank and the IMF are. I think the SGR, the Standard Gauge Railway, is adding about 1.25 of that 6%. So I'm pretty confident that we're going to see that sort of growth. But if you look back, Terry-Ann, it's all about sustaining high growth. It's not about hitting that number for one quarter like we did in the fourth quarter of 2007. Prior to that, you're looking back at the coffee boom in the 70s, and then you're looking back at independence. And I think the challenge is we've got to get up there and we've got to stay up there. And that's what I'm looking for us to achieve. So we are a bright spot at the moment in the continent. You only have to look around at some of the oil producers, for example, who are really under pressure. So I'm confident we can get to 6, but I don't think we're going to hit the 7. And I think also inbuilt in that budget is a very big borrowing requirement of nearly 500 billion shillings. Last year, the Cabinet Secretary could put his hand up and the market would say, how much do you want, Mr. Rotich? 1 billion? Is it 2 billion? I'm not so sure the markets are like that this year. I think the markets are more nervous. You can see that, Terry-Ann, in the way African currencies have suffered this year. Only one African currency has appreciated against the dollar. Incredibly, that's the Malawian kwacha, but that's because it fell so much the year before. But you can see that the pressure has built, that the markets are a little bit more stressed, and then you've probably got a rate hike coming out of the US. So I'm just questioning that 500 billion shilling call that the Cabinet Secretary is going to make on the markets.
Ali Khan, let's talk, Nikhil, my apologies. Let's talk about that 570 billion budget deficit. Should they, there was a mention of both borrowing internally and externally as well? Should they rely more on the external markets? How do you see that playing out given the current position of the shilling?
Well, look, I think the first thing we need to appreciate about the deficit is that if you look at the last 4 or 5 years, we've had ever-increasing budgets. So we started at 1.4, 1.6, 1.8, 2.2. But in none of those years did we actually spend what we budgeted. A lot of those funds, I would estimate 20, maybe as much as 25%, actually came back at the end of the year because of tight procurement policies and things like that. So in a sense, although we're saying 570 billion, I don't think we're going to spend quite as much, and we're not probably going to collect quite as much either. So that number is likely to contract a little bit. Should we go into the foreign market? Well, if the funds are available, yes, but it seems to me that if the shilling continues to depreciate, and maybe Ali Khan, you're more au fait with this, but if the shilling is depreciating the way it is, then at some point we're going to have to repay this. And that repayment is going to be at a significant premium as a result of the depreciation. On the other hand, borrowing in the local market is squeezing all these folks out, which is not good for the growth of the economy either.
Now, of course, the government will argue that the size of the budget is reflective of especially some of the really big projects that they need to do. For example, the standard gauge railway, infrastructure as a whole. And Polycarp, maybe you can come in at this point. How important is it for the government to put in that amount of money into infrastructure? Is it a necessary evil at this time?
I think it's an extremely necessary, not evil, virtue. I'll put it this way. This government has focused on the cost to live. Forget about cost of living, the cost to live. What drives the cost to live? It's energy, which is electricity, matatu bus fare, fuel cost, and those elements we have seen a change. There's been a dramatic shift in our energy mix in geothermal, after geothermal came in and thermals were switched off to the detriment of people like me, who is an oil marketer. But that's something to celebrate. So when your cost to live comes down, it means when I'm a manufacturer, I can have a competitive cost. My fixed cost line comes down a little bit. Then I'm able to produce a bit and become more competitive. And therefore, I think that's a very important aspect. At the same time, it's very important to settle the population around health, around education, and around the poorest of the poor. Because if you don't look at those things, I think the minister really tried to balance. He did try to balance that. But Nihil raises a very good point. Government must accelerate and really commit, walk the talk in terms of e-procurement, because I think that's going to be Jubilee government's really flagship. More than anything else, if they get e-procurement right, so that by the time they procure to pay, the cycle today is years. It needs to come down to 30 days. And they can do that. And also they procure properly using e-procurement, because that will help them absorb. Their budget absorption will come down now from maybe the 70-80% towards the 90%. Because government, remember, is the biggest customer to any manufacturer or trader. And when they don't spend money, even the guy who sells you newspaper on the street tells you they're not spending money. So it's and we need to almost put a scorecard, a performance contract, and tell any civil servant or minister who returns money to the budget, you should publish them for us to see who they are, because they are letting us down. They should not return money to the exchequer. They should spend that money and spend it effectively so that the economy can really... They are the people who raise the tide, and we are the boats on this tide. So and every boat rises with the rise of the tide. So investment in infrastructure, especially transport and logistics. I love the road annuity program with 10,000 kilometers of roads, sewerages. That program is actually something to be hailed. And the younger generation has to accept that we have to borrow to do this, so that...
That is saying the older generation has agreed and the younger generation...
Of course, our all-marketeer friend here is not saying that he's quite happy to see us stuck on traffic jams because he makes big profits. But the point is that with that...
I mean, no farmer cries when it rains.
but without the infrastructure, the amount of time we're sitting in traffic jams is a loss of huge amounts of productive time. So without the infrastructure, we're not going to go forward. And if you look at emerging markets around the world, the ones that have really succeeded, Southeast Asia, they've succeeded because they built their infrastructure and then they said, come and invest. We're sort of doing it the other way around. And we've allowed our infrastructure to deteriorate. So the focus that the minister gave on, the cabinet secretary gave on infrastructure was, to me, one of the very positive things that came out of what he was saying, as long as we implement.
All right. And that's, of course, from a Mwananchi point of view. And I'd like to flip the coin, and Fred, I'd like to you to give a comment here about what the investment, the heavy investment in infrastructure means towards the cost of doing business in East Africa.
Ideally, it should result in a reduction of cost of doing business because infrastructure is a facilitator, really, and it facilitates investment, but also in terms of movement of goods, movement of personnel. So it's a facilitator, and that should result in reduction of cost of doing business. Of course, in the short term, probably there's going to be a negative, if I call it that, impact in terms of investors have to pay for this, and that's the existing businesses in terms of higher taxes. But in the long run, and investment in infrastructure is a long-term thing, in the long run that should result in lowering the cost of doing business, but also attracting new investment, because that's one of the considerations for any investor in terms of determining where they want to locate their investment. And Kenya being a hub for the region, I think it's really, really important that we address the infrastructure that we have in place. For me, other than just the huge numbers that have been allocated to infrastructure, I think we need to speed up the pace of implementation, because when we talk about a road and 5 years down the line it's not yet being built, then of course there is even if we talk about time cost of money, then we are losing something. So we need to speed up the pace of implementation of these infrastructure projects. That means we address procurement that he was talking about. We address the quality issues, because Kenyans are looking at the value of money and the cost that we incur to build up this infrastructure. So we must get a good quality product. And yes, like Polycarp has mentioned, we probably need to factor this in the performance evaluation of the key civil servants that are responsible for these flagship projects.
Yes. Ali Khan, let's talk about capital gains tax and the scrapping of that from the sale of shares. How do you see that working out, and do you see the new levy working better than the capital gains tax?
So clearly the capital gains tax completely cut the legs from underneath the stock market. We went into a bear market, and I think there were a number of reasons, but this was a reason. There was too much uncertainty over it. There was a sense that there's nowhere in the world a stockbroker is going to apply capital gains tax on anybody, right? Why are we doing that? So in a way, this comes back to a point when sometimes I think we make policy and we realize it's not working, we take a little bit too long to reverse it. And my theory is that if you're a policymaker in Kenya versus one in the US, you've got to be smarter here, because you've got less margin for a maneuver than in a developed country. So I think since it was repealed, we've had 2 strong days of the stock market. That was Friday and today. I'm hoping that we will have a similar response to what Egypt had, which also delayed the capital gains tax by 2 years, and we saw it rally about 10%. So well received. On the 0.3%, my only issue with that is that it is quite expensive to transact at the Securities Exchange when you look at all-in costs compared to other places in the world. And I think we've also got to look at that and say to ourselves, we want to attract investors in, we've got to make ourselves cheaper for someone to come in and out. But overall, look, it was overdue. I'm glad it happened, and it's a positive. If I could just add one last thing to the infrastructure thing that Fred was talking about. It's not only about us. In order to cement our position in this region as the hub, one, we can't rest on our laurels, but 2, we got to make these investments, because we got to have a first-class infrastructure, because hopefully we'll earn fees from everybody, whether it's South Sudan when it recovers a little bit, Uganda, or Hunza, or the DRC. So it's selfish. We want better infrastructure, but it's also in our national interest. We have to cement our position, otherwise someone else will pop up somewhere else and start doing what we should have been doing. And the last thing I would say is, you know, we talk about the roads, but let's be honest, you know, we're not dreaming big enough, I don't think. Look at the bypass, it's a single lane. I was on the Mombasa-Nairobi road, the place is built up to Machakos. Why isn't there a dual carriageway? Right? So I think the longer we leave these things, the trickier it's going to be.
All right. Thank you so much. We're just about to take a short break now. And when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about banking. I'd like to hear your comments as well about the proposals for Kenyans to take part in bills and bonds for as little as 3,000 shillings. So quite some interesting discussions coming right after this break. Don't go too far.